this beautiful martin looked right at me.
Hello and welcome to Nature Magic. Today I'm talking to Ruth Hanniffy. Ruth is Species Conservation Officer at the Vincent Wildlife Trust and is based at the National University of Ireland, Galway. She is presently undertaking a dietary analysis of lesser horseshoe bats, but today we are talking to her about that ancient, elusive Irish creature, the pinemartin or tree cat. The pine marten is rarely seen and only really spoken about when it has created mischief. Ruth is a voice for the pine marten so that we can learn more about this beautiful animal and why it is a key predator in our ecosystem and how we can easily manage any conflict that may arise with humans. Hi, Ruth. Thank you so much for coming onto the Nature Magic podcast.
Hi, Mary. It is great to be here.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. I'm sitting in Galway and looking out onto a very sunny meadow. Can you tell the listeners where you are today?
I am in my lab in NUI Galway, which is a beautiful place to be, lovely, vibrant university campus. And it is also a lovely day.
Very good. And you are working in wildlife conservation. Do you want to tell the listeners what you do, what your role is, and how did you get into the wildlife conservation?
Yes, of course. Well, it's all I ever wanted to do. So I actually studied zoology here in NUI Galway for my undergrad. Moved to the UK to study wildlife management and conservation. But my research projects were always on mammals, small mammals, lesser horseshoe bats. And then after that, I worked for about 9 years in the field of river restoration in the UK, which was an amazing grounding in everything from mammals, riparian habitat, geomorphology, working with volunteers, and also the effects of access to nature on people's physical and mental health. So really interesting place to work.
Oh my
And
goodness,
then,
it sounds like there's a few podcast episodes in
yes.
there. I'm trying not to go off on a tangent.
It's a fascinating topic. And then after period traveling, came back to Ireland and worked in fisheries for a little while and started with Vincent Wildlife Trust. I'm here about 7.5 years now. And my title is Species Project Officer, and the species I work on are the lesser horseshoe bat, the pine marten, and the Irish stoat. So you can imagine, as a biodiversity officer working in southeast England and on the tidal Thames, lesser horseshoe bats and pine martens were animals I could only dream of working on. So it is wonderful, and it's lovely to be back working on these species in Galway and in Ireland again.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Vincent Wildlife Trust?
Yes, of course. Well, we are an NGO working on mammals in need, and we've been playing a key role in bat conservation in Ireland since 1991, working on the lesser horseshoe bat. And most people will be familiar with my colleague, Kate McInerney, who has been at the forefront of lesser horseshoe bat conservation since the 80s. And now we focus on three key species: the lesser horseshoe bat, and our work for the lesser horseshoe bat is primarily in population restoration, and we own or lease 12 roosts, maternity roosts for the species down the west coast, because it's only found from Mayo down to West Cork. The pine marten, for which our work is very much focused on conflict management, so we manage the relationship between people and pine martens, and also monitoring. For example, we were involved in the pine marten population assessment, and we manage pinemartin.ie, a website dedicated to information on the pine marten in Ireland. And then innovative monitoring for species like the Irish stoat. And we will be starting a citizen science survey of the Irish stoat in January 2023, asking people for their sightings of the animal and looking at where it is in the country, and also on the Isle of Man, where the subspecies is also found, which is really interesting. So I recommend a visit to our website. It is www.vincentwildlife.ie, and it's a wonderful resource on many of our native mammals. And what I love about it is that the information there was written by the people who undertook their PhDs on these species, so they really have the detailed knowledge of how this animal interacts with the flora and fauna in Ireland, where wildlife does tend to have a different niche here because of different predators, different habitats, and different prey. So for people studying these species, it's really important to look at them from an Irish context, because they do tend to have different niches and slightly different nuances than in other parts of Europe.
Well, thank you so much to everybody in the Vincent Wildlife Trust. Today, we're trying to give a big shout out to the pine martin because we feel it doesn't have much of a voice in Ireland, and any kind of rumours you hear about the pine martin are normally about them sneaking into the chickens and things like that. So we need the pine martin. And can you explain to the listener what the pine martin is and any sort of behaviours or the habitats it inhabits?
They're a fascinating creature to work on. They're from the mustelid family, which is also called the weasel family. And mustelids are really interesting to work on anyway. The other native mustelids we have are the Irish stoat, the badger, the otter, and then we have some non-native mustelids in Ireland, like the American mink, and the feral ferret. And as a family of carnivores, they're really important commercially. They've historically been trapped. They've been raised for their fur, for their beautiful pelts, and then they help control prey populations. For example, people will know if ferrets going down burrows after rabbits. But not only that, they're really interesting animals. They tend to have this long body and short legs, and they're all individually adapted for their habitats. For example, otters are fantastic swimmers. Pine martins, as we'll talk about, are supremely skilled climbers, and we know badgers are brilliant at digging. And they have this need to eat very regularly to keep up this their high metabolism. So they're very curious, very inquisitive animals they're looking to feed. And they can't, for example, we'll hear of a lion eating a deer and a carcass and having to sleep it off for a couple of days, whereas mustelids can't do that. They need to keep feeding and feeding. So they're very inquisitive and clever animals.
We have a wildlife capture camera down in our rewilded area, and within one night we had a fox walk past, then a badger, and then a pine martin. So it's so, precious to see the pine martin.
It really is. And they're a beautiful creature to work on. And most of the mustelids, except badgers, are solitary, which I think people find surprising. The male and female will only come together to mate, and you won't find large family groups like you do with some other species. So the pine martin has been in Ireland since the early Neolithic. It came here about 6,000 years ago. And that is one of the things that sometimes is misunderstood, that they're thought to be not a native species. And that's because they were almost wiped out to extinction. So people stopped seeing them in the countryside. They stopped being something that was talked about. And then people began to see them again. So thought that they had been brought here by man and introduced. Well, the pine martin has been in Ireland since the early Neolithic. They've been here for the last 6,000 years. And they have the most beautiful Irish name, which is cat cran. And cat cran literally translates as tree cat. And there really is no better description for the animal. They're supremely adapted to this really complex woodland habitat. They're expert climbers. They're incredibly agile. And to look at, they're a beautiful animal. They have their beautiful fur, their beautiful pelt. It's darker underneath. They have this long bushy tail, and this tail is very important to help them counterbalance when they're climbing up trees and when they're up off the canopy. And that's where they like to be. They like to be up off the ground. They like to be up off the ground to get away from predators and disturbance and to feel safer. They have this cream colored throat patch, and that's fascinating because it's like a fingerprint. So for anybody with a trail camera or that sees a pine martin regularly, you can tell if it's the same one. And we can't do that with, for example, if we're monitoring Irish stoat, there's no way to tell individuals like there is with pine martins. So that's very useful. And our colleagues have put together what they call very cleverly a bibliography, because this bib can really tell us a lot about the individual, whether we've got different individuals coming.
That's very clever. Yeah, excellent. I'll take a note of that and see if we get the same guy on our camera trap again.
Yeah, definitely worth doing. They have these semi-retractable claws, which they use for climbing, this beautiful pointed head, rounded ears, this almost feline-like muzzle. And their summer coat can be sleeker and darker, whereas in winter, the coat is thicker and browner and shaggier, so they can look a bit bigger, and that's obviously to retain heat. And as I said, mustelids have long body and short legs, but pine martens, that the legs are proportionally longer. And like all mustelid, they're incredibly strong for their body size. So the name pine marten is somewhat misleading because they're not just confined to pine forests. They're woodland specialists, but they are found in all types of temperate forests, deciduous, pine, scrub, and somewhere that they've really managed to keep a stronghold is the Burren, which you wouldn't classically think of as a forested habitat, but obviously has a huge amount of really nice
hazel and lovely shrubbery.
Exactly.
And what are they looking for to feed on? I know they eat berries, and they're omnivores, are they?
Yes, they're omnivores, and they eat whatever's locally abundant at that time of year. So this could be small mammals, birds, carrion, insects, amphibians, and then in autumn lots of fruit and berries. So they I guess like any mammal or animal trying to use its energy efficiently, they will go after what's locally abundant, and
including chickens. Including chickens, which has given them a bit of a bad reputation.
Yes. And that is something we will cover shortly, actually, how we've managed to try to manage the conflict between people and pine martens. But what's very helpful about what they eat is they leave they're a very helpful animal to study because they leave what are their droppings called scats, and they choose very obvious areas. For example, a forest path, the top of a tree stump. If I was looking for a pine marten in a woodland, I would go to a fallen log and look on this higher place. So they leave these scats to communicate with other pine martens. They're a communication tool. But by looking at the scat, you can tell what they've been eating. So in autumn, these scats are very full of berries. You might see small mammal bones in the scat. So they can give us some information as well of what they've been eating.
Excellent. And what challenges does the species encounter?
They were almost driven to extinction. And this was, so originally they were found in every county in Ireland. They were widespread across the whole island. But by the mid-20th century, they were extinct from most of the country. There were a few isolated populations, as I said, in the Burren, in the west of Ireland, in County Waterford and Portlaw, and this woodland has become an important study area for the site with Waterford IT. The reason for this decline was they were persecuted, they were poisoned, both indirect and direct poisoning, and much of their forest habitat was lost. So a huge amount of deforestation. And of course, they were hunted for their fur, which was an important trade material. So this decline meant that in 1976, they were legally protected by the Wildlife Act. And the first survey carried out of them was by Paddy O'Sullivan in the 1970s and 80s. And he looked at scat surveys and sightings. And this gave us our first map of the pine marten in Ireland, which showed just how decimated the population was and just how few areas really that they were remaining in the country. So the next survey was in 2005, 2006. So again, about 30 years after they were protected. And this showed that the population had expanded, particularly in Connacht and in Mayo and towards parts of Leinster, but really a very, very slow recovery. And this is because they're a slow producing species. They'll only give birth to 2 to 3 young. These are called kits. They only give birth when they're in their 3rd year. So they're not an animal that's going to be giving birth to a lot of litters for survival. They will have 2 or 3 kids that they will look after. That it's the way that humans will operate also, to have a small number of young, but to care for them so that they can survive.
And do they make a nest, Ruth? Or because I know there are some kind of boxes you can put up to help them, or what's there?
No, so they create dens, and pine marten like to den off the ground in trees. That is their preferred habitat. And back when they came to Ireland 6,000 years ago, Ireland was covered in these amazing native, probably mainly broadleaf woodlands. However, with a huge amount of our woodland loss, those habitats have become scarcer and fewer and far between. So they like to den off the ground in things like holes and tree cavities. They may use squirrel drays. Sometimes they could use log piles or burrows.
And obviously the trees, now we take down any dead trees on the whole, but I mean, originally the dead trees were a home for owls and pine martens and everything as they rotted, and then there were holes in the trees, but there are so few of them now.
Oh, dead trees are an incredible habitat, whether it's for insects and fungi right up to mammals, and really they're probably an overlooked but really, really key habitat, deadwood habitat. And Ireland has some of the lowest levels of forest cover in Europe. So by the beginning of the 20th century, only 1% of Ireland had any of its original woodland cover remaining. And now we're at about 2% native woodland or mixed broadleaf woodland. So we know that Ireland has about 11% forest cover, some of the lowest in Europe, but some of the fastest growing forest cover in Europe. But only 2% of this is native or mixed broadleaf. So our forest cover is growing, but generally it's for plantation and it's non-native species. And these don't provide the cracks and crevices and flora and fauna at ground level that our native creatures have grown to depend on and have evolved with. So the type of
there's I think there's a helpful new change in the CAP now. It's called acres. I think I might be wrong there, but we have 25 acres that's rewilded on the farm. The farm's only 50 acres, so we've left 25 acres for wildlife, and obviously that's growing up for shrub and everything, but we never got paid on that because it wasn't forage area. So with your farm payments you got paid for forage area, and the department guy used to go in trying to look for grass, but he got lost one time. He couldn't find any, so we didn't get paid. But now you can get paid, I believe you can get paid for up to half of your farm to leave it to nature. And if that is the case, that's going to be extremely helpful for woodlands and for wildlife.
There is also a native woodland scheme, and Vincent Wildlife Trust are part of this in County Kerry. And this is replacing non-native conifer habitat with native woodlands. And we're really looking forward to seeing how that grows up in the future. And that's part of a really helpful scheme.
That's amazing. And what else can we do to help the pine marten? If somebody has a farm that they're listening to this program, is there anything they can do that you suggest?
Yes, well, what we have been doing is, so part of one of the strands of work that Vincent Wildlife Trust is involved in is conflict management. And this is very much concerned with pine martens, because if you take a forest dwelling woodland specialist and you lose a lot of its native habitat and where it dens, it's looking for alternative denning sites as the population is recovering. And because of this, pine martens in some cases have found the same secure off the ground denning sites in attics of occupied and unoccupied houses, and that has brought them into contact with people, and they don't make good house guests. And we have a huge amount of empathy for anybody that does have a pine marten in their attic, and it's not a pleasant experience. But what we can do are create artificial denning sites that pine martens will readily use. So these are called den boxes. They're put high off the ground, maybe 3 meters off the ground in a suitable tree, and they will replicate those features of cracks and crevices. And they've been put up, and we're involved in den box schemes in England and Scotland, and we have a number of den box up in Ireland. They are readily taken up by female pine martens who use them to as a denning site and give birth to their kits in them. So they provide that feature that you would find in an old dead tree, or as well as that, it's generally trees of about 100 years old will have the kind of features that would provide suitable habitat for a den. And across Europe, where there are pine martens, we have species like black woodpecker, and black woodpecker nests provide that perfect size. But we don't have black woodpecker in Ireland. We do now have greater spotted woodpecker, but again, the holes aren't really big enough. So it's trying to provide what would have been found in nature originally in very old large trees. So these den boxes are a fantastic measure and do work, and we use them to retain pine martens in the woodlands where they prefer to be, where they're safer, and which keeps them out of contact and conflict with humans.
Oh, very good. So can people contact the Vincent Wildlife Trust if they have a pine marten in their attic, or what would they do?
So pine marten can only be removed from an attic under license by a National Parks and Wildlife Service conservation ranger. But the key take-home message is that you need to ensure that your attic is pine marten proof before the key period when the female is looking for a denning site. Generally, she will be doing that in February or March. And pine martens can access attics through very small gaps. A hole that's over 4 centimeters in width is big enough for a female to get through. But also if there's old, dead, rotting wood, a marten can use their teeth to enlarge this and get through. So we created a little video last year, which I can send you a link to. And that was to encourage people to check their fascia and soffit and attic spaces really around St. Patrick's Day to look for any holes or gaps, because a female will be looking out for a site then. And the issue is that once a female gets in and gives birth to the young, which is generally early to mid-April, it's too late then, because if the female and the young are disturbed, she may abandon them. And a pine marten is a protected species under the Wildlife Act and also under Annex 5 of the Habitats Directive. So it's ensuring that they don't get in the first place, because once a female has gotten into den, then it's an infinitely more complicated situation. And generally we need to wait until the female and the juveniles have left. Now, when the young are born, they're blind, hairless, completely dependent on the female for the first few weeks of life, and they're not leaving the young, they're not leaving the den, and they're absolutely tiny. But as they get older and they're still in the den, that's when people will notice that they're there, because they will hear these animals making noise, and the female may be bringing in mice or voles to feed them. And really that's where a lot of the disturbance comes from. And you can have urine and the prey species left there after they're eaten. So really it's making sure that the holes and gaps aren't there for the animal to find this denning site and feel that it's a suitable.
Oh, that's very good advice. Have you had any special encounter with a pine marten?
Oh, goodness. Do you know, I've been working on pine martens now for 7.5 years, and including serving for them for months at a time in the field as part of the pine marten population assessment. I'm a wildlife and landscape photographer. All of my hobbies involve being outside, although many of them involve being in the sea where I won't find a pine marten. But I have so few encounters. So that really shows me that they are elusive. I mean, there are some people who will have a pine marten that's curious and coming up to its door, and especially if pine martens know that there is food in a particular garden. But my encounters have been a pine marten being very nervous, very vigilant, and vanishing out of sight. But my best encounters have been in the Schlieve Blooms and Glory Hides with Kevin McCann, where I have rented the hide to photograph the pine marten. And when you see the pine marten photographs on our website, or for example recently with the All Ireland Pine Marten Symposium, they are photos that I've taken from the hide, and it's been magical, because even though I was in the hide behind this big long lens, hidden and wearing soft materials and making no noise, this beautiful marten looked right at me and was so conscious that I was there. You know, you just knew that it was nervous and it was taking the food that had been left for it, but it was so conscious there was a human there, and it was spending no time hanging about, and it was leaving as soon as it could. But just to see this animal I've spent so many years working to protect and to help people to understand right in front of me,
that's absolutely marvelous. Now I've seen one twice in my life. So once on the farm years ago, just trotting along the top of a wall in the middle of the day. And then I saw one crossing the road in the Burren in front of me.
Oh, yes.
So unfortunately, I saw a roadkill only yesterday. But I mean, maybe that shows that there are more around, hopefully.
Well, when the juveniles, so they're solitary. So you if you see a number of them together, it's generally a couple of juveniles with the female with their mum. So they then have to go and find their own territories. And this can take sometimes 6 to 16 months, but generally in the few months after they leave the den, they will be heading off to find their own territories, which is called dispersing. And that's often when juveniles are killed on the road. And juveniles are like the young of any species. They don't really know, they don't have the same sense of where to
Health
go and where
safety.
to go. Exactly. So they can be the ones doing ridiculous things that get them into conflict with people, and just being clueless. So that's when they're dispersing, and that's when we think quite a good few are killed on the road. But if people do see roadkill pine martens, or ideally a pine marten in that's alive, we always encourage them to report them to the National Biodiversity Data Centre or to use the app. And that helps us to look at where they are, to keep an eye on areas where pine martens weren't recorded previously. For example, we have very few records from North and West Cork, which is interesting. There's been a big gap there. Right. But these records really help scientists and help conservation organisations like Vincent Wildlife Trust to look at where the species is recovering or where there are gaps in distribution. And we have had an all-Ireland squirrel and pine marten survey. So that's looking at distribution of red squirrel, grey squirrel and pine marten in 2007, 2012 and most recently 2019. And that's where we call on members of the public to send in these sightings and make a concentrated effort to highlight that we're looking for records, and that is roadkill as well as live sightings. And that helps us to create distribution maps and look at how the species, those three species especially, their interactions have changed over time.
Interesting. So it was up kind of North Mayo, actually. We went up there. That's where I saw it. So what do I say to the person that has chickens and has a sort of hatred towards the pine marten because they're afraid the pine marten is going to come in and kill all the chickens?
Yes.
Or what do we do to prevent? I mean, it's very hard to keep chickens out of. I mean, sorry, it's very hard to keep pine martens out of the chicken pen.
That all comes down to animal husbandry, which is ensuring that your pen is pine marten proof. So a number of years ago, in response to the issues between people and pine martens, we teamed up with the National Parks and Wildlife Service and we created pinemartin.ie. This website is a national resource for the pine marten in Ireland, and we want to respond to all of the queries and issues that we deal with on a regular basis. So this website is aimed at journalists who are writing articles so they could access facts, information, as well as photographs and footage of pine martens, gun clubs and poultry keepers, foresters and farmers, and householders. And householders have been one of the key groups that we've seen access the website when we've looked at the analytics, which has been very interesting. And for householders, it's often keeping a pine marten out of their attic space, but also people trying to keep chickens not on a commercial basis, but just a pen in the back garden. And often, these chickens may be pets and the family may have named the chickens and they really come to mean a lot to the family. So really it's down to ensuring that
building the right pen.
Exactly.
So you can get advice on there. That's amazing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are step-by-step videos, PDFs and guidance, but essentially it's some of the things I mentioned earlier. Ensure that there are no gaps, including in the netting, that are greater than 4 centimetres. Ensure the wood is good quality and isn't rotting after a winter of rain, for example, so it can't be chewed and enlarged by the pine marten. And as well as that, that pine martens aren't diggers, but you could have another animal dig a hole underneath, and that would allow access for pine marten to clean underneath. Pine martens are fantastic climbers. So a chicken pen to keep out a fox wouldn't need to take into account a roof, but for an avian predator or a pine marten, you need to take into account that they're brilliant climbers. That pine martens are brilliant climbers. And if there are trees nearby within 1 to 2 meters of a pen and it's open, a marten can just jump in. So it's ensuring that those extra measures are taken so that a pine marten can't access the pen.
So we can live happily together with the pine marten.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
brilliant.
as I mentioned, mustelids are curious. So they are clever and curious, and given enough time, particularly, for example, over winter nights, a lot of darkness, pine marten has a lot of time to figure out the pen and see if there are any access points. So one of the main things we've recommended in our work with gun clubs is electrified netting. Now, this isn't always possible for people keeping pens at home. So we have been trialing deterrent systems, and some of these are ultrasonic, give off a very high-pitched call, may have a flashing light or a foul smell, or spray water. So once we have a deterrent that works, we're trialing these for the last number of months at a couple of sites in Galway and Mayo. So once we have one that works, we will be continue to test that, ideally in a structured way at different parts of the country, and we will be highlighting that on our website, but we're not going to put out methods that we haven't tried and tested. Yeah. But householders do sometimes find pine martens get into their wheelie bins because people who don't have access to somewhere to maybe compost or get rid of things will put them in the bin. So for some people that's not something they want. So we've trialed an item called a bin strap, which is a really simple item that you can drill a hole in your bin. And it was originally designed in Galway to keep bins from blowing open and allowing rubbish to blow into the sea, and for pollution, because it's such a windy part of the country and keeping wheelie bins closed in winter can be tough work. I know that myself from growing up in Galway. So these keep the bin closed, and you'll see on pinemartin.ie and on vincentwildlife.ie where we have monitored the pine marten using a trail camera, and it cannot get in, and trying its best to get through the spin strap and it can't. So when we see that, we can say, right, bingo, this is a very low cost item that you can use and it works. And it's interesting because the gentleman where we tested the bin strap loves his pinemartin. So we were conscious to get it off the bin so he wouldn't lose his beloved martin. But for someone
yeah, we have one line of electric around the top of we've got 2 ducks at the moment in the orchard, and there's a fence which is dug into the ground so the foxes can't dig in, and one line of electric around the top. We had one instance a few years ago when somebody did get in, but since then nothing, and the ducks go in and out to their house themselves, so we don't actually shut them in at night, and they seem to be safe. Can you tell us why it's important to preserve predators in the ecosystem and the pine martin, obviously?
Oh, that's a good big question there.
Yeah, just briefly.
just throw that one out there. Well, they are an integral part of our ecosystem. They've been here, as I said, since the early Neolithic, and they are as integral a part as the other species that we work on. For example, the Irish stoat, the lesser horseshoe bat. When Ireland was blanketed in forestry, and none of us, or our grandparents or great grandparents, and even our nearest ancestors were here, these animals were here, and other creatures that we need to look to protect. For example, the pygmy shrew, the red squirrel. These are all an integral part of this beautiful island. They're at their outermost edge of their range in the west of Europe. They've adapted to our mild climate. They've adapted to our habitats. And really, the reason that they are in decline is not because of anything they've done themselves. It's because of how humans have changed the landscape. And I think it's incumbent on us as guardians of this landscape and the species that use it to really protect them and ensure that we don't lose species to extinction, but not even to extinction, that we don't see their numbers driven to a point that they can't recover. And that really is our duty, because they can't do that for themselves. The loss of habitat and the impacts on these animals are coming from us and what we do.
Yeah. And thank you for the fabulous work that you're doing to try and help the pine martins. And we used to do a thing with the kids on the school tours where they'd hold a string, and it was the web of life. So they'd pass the ball of wool to the next person. So it'd say goat, and you'd have to say, what's the goat connected to? Grass. And then eventually you get this big like spider's web, with all the children in a circle. And then they would, if you showed them, if you dropped one species, how the web would collapse. Mm-hmm. So even all these small little species that you think they're, maybe not holding up our ecosystem, but they're all so integral, aren't they?
Well, I heard a beautiful answer to this question on Tuesday evening when NPWS Conservation Ranger Sinead began, and I were lucky enough to be interviewed for 6-1 News by George Lee, and we were monitoring lesser horseshoe bats at a wonderful reserve with a fantastic farming couple, Liam and Dolly Walsh. And this is part of the Lesser Horseshoe Bat Species Action Plan, which will be launched next week. And so George and John, the wonderful cameraman, filmed Lesser Horseshoe Bats and talked to Sinead and I about the species and their role and their ecology and the work that has been done to protect them. And when Sinead was asked a similar question, she said that there is, as part of our culture, as the GAA, as our folklore and our wildlife even predates these, and is as an integral a part of our culture as these things that we hold so dear and we treasure. And I thought it was the most perfect answer, and one I'm going to borrow for this interview. And Sinead is from Limerick and a very, very keen hurling fan, and was up at the All Ireland recently. So for her to say something like that, I thought was really powerful, and I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, that actually gives me the shivers. It's a great answer. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And I fully believe in something being here for its own sake. We don't need to find a reason to look to protect it. But the recent experiences of people working on red and grey squirrels and people come into contact with red squirrels for the first time in 20 years has really helped to drive home that it is a balance. It is a species balance. And what's happened is that people were seeing red squirrels in parts of the country that they hadn't seen them in 20 years. And they were used to seeing grey squirrels, but they hadn't seen grey squirrels in quite a while. And there was something afoot, and this needed to be investigated. And the grey squirrel is a non-native invasive species, which means it hasn't been here. Anything here before the 1500s is regarded as native or naturalized. The grey squirrel was brought here in 1911, and it was a gift given to an estate in Newtown Forbes in County Longford, a wedding gift. And really, as wedding gifts go, it's up there with the worst there must be, because of the legacy, which is that the species became very successful in Ireland, spread out, dominated, and saw the decline of our native red squirrel. And the native red squirrel has been here for thousands of years, has evolved with the pinemartin, but the grey squirrel is larger. It can survive in more habitats. It can survive more on the ground, so it can adapt to much more habitats. For example, people see it in urban environments. And it also carries a squirrel pox virus, which kills the red squirrel. It doesn't harm the grey squirrel. So we saw that decimate red squirrel populations, and in other areas, for example, in the UK, red squirrels driven to very few areas and extinct from much of the country. But with this slow recovery of the pinemartin, especially in the survey I mentioned, 2007. It seems that the grey squirrel has retracted from a broad area. Now this has expanded to 9 counties in the Midlands, and that's been due to the recovery of the pinemartin. Now it's very much on a woodland level when the population of pinemartins reaches a certain density, but that has resulted in grey squirrel numbers crashing. And then with the lag period of maybe 2 years, red squirrels have been able to recover. So amazing. That is really, yes, it is amazing. And I think other scientists working on these species outside of Ireland are looking to us to see what's happening in the mechanism, because it's been this incredible natural recovery of the much loved red squirrel.
And the systems are so complex that you really need it to be a natural intervention to really work sustainably.
What's really interesting is that there's been a huge amount of research from Josh Twining and Dave Tosh in Ulster, Con Lawton and Emma Sheehy in NUI Galway, and Emma's work in Scotland, and Kat McNichol in the UK. And that has been to really look at what the mechanism is, whether what it is that was having that effect. So this work has shown us that it's what we call a predator naive response. So Josh and Dave's recent work has shown us that it's a predator naive response, which is that the red squirrel is very alert when it's aware of pinemartin presence. And this was a pinemartin scent was used to test this, whereas a grey squirrel isn't alert of a predator nearby. It doesn't have the same watch out, whereas a red squirrel knows that it needs to be cautious, and it's aware of this predator, and that's because they've evolved together. So for that reason,
that's fascinating, isn't it? Absolutely fascinating.
It is, and it's been a really interesting narrative, and I think it really can drive home how fascinating ecology is in Ireland and how our species are ever changing. I mean, I mentioned the pygmy shrew, which is now under threat from the non-native greater white-toothed shrew. Really, our wildlife isn't fixed, and our species aren't fixed, and we have invasive species coming, and we have we just see changes in our native wildlife, and that's why I really encourage anyone interested in studying in this field that it is an interesting and exciting place to research. And our wildlife acts differently here than it does across Europe, because it's much milder. There is a different assemblage of species and predators. Many of our native animals rely heavily on hedgerows. We know that barn owls do, badgers do, and our lesser horseshoe bats do, because we've lost so much of our woodland, but we really have our hedgerows are our jewel, and they link up the good areas of habitat. So protecting and looking after our hedgerows is key to ensuring our wildlife can navigate.
I think that's the dream, that every farm would give some space over to nature, and that all the farms could be connected either by riparian corridors or by hedgerows. So because we feel like we are an island here for the wildlife. If they venture their noses out of here, they haven't a hope. It's all conventional farming, and people do not want predators on their land. So if they could just connect up the country, it would give them so much more of a chance, and then give the forests time to recover. And what else can you recommend for people to do to support wildlife or any of the particular species that you're working on?
Well, a lot of people email our website, and they would love to have whether it's red squirrels or pine martins, or they would love to have these species near them. And what I do is I look up the National Biodiversity Data Centre mapping system, and I see where the closest records are. Now, records are where somebody has submitted a sighting, so it could be that they're nearby, but just people haven't submitted them. And that's why when people do submit sightings to the data centre, it really does inform a huge amount of what we can tell people and our knowledge. But essentially, it's down to habitat. It's ensuring that an animal can get there sustainably of its own accord. The idea of translocations, they're hugely costly. They can only be done under strict licenses and with a huge amount of pre-feasibility to ensure an animal can survive there. The most sustainable way for anything to happen is for it to happen naturally. So especially people contact us, wondering if there's any way to encourage squirrels to their area. And I always say it's down to the habitat, that the native food plant and the native species that these animals look to den or create strays in, that's what they need, so that the animal can find its way to where these habitat blocks. So it's all about habitat.
It's all really about improving. I mean, even this morning I had an email from somebody saying, I want to leave half my garden over to a wildflower meadow, what seeds can I sow? And I was explaining, you don't need to sow the seeds, this is how you manage it with cutting, and perhaps you could leave a corner just for shrubs, to give a little space. So more people who can do that, leave somewhere for animals to go or even hide for a minute. And just before we go, Ruth, have you got a book that you'd like to recommend to the listeners? I always ask the podcast guests if they have a recommended book. It doesn't have to be about pine martins, but something to do with nature.
Yes, I do. There is a book called Pine Martins, and it's written by Johnny Burks, who worked with Vincent Wildlife Trust in the UK years ago, and is a superb ecologist and a real pine marten champion. And Johnny Burks and John Martin have been coordinating one of the big den box schemes in Galway for the last 20 years. And I was lucky enough to go to Galway in May and undertake the den box checks with them, because they're now handing over the project to Forestry and Land Scotland. And Johnny's book, I was reading it in preparation for this podcast. And there are times when I laugh out loud, because Johnny is such a fantastic ecologist, but also witty, and has just a real love of these species. And it's written in a way that's it's full of science, and it's so informative, but it's a beautiful story to read. And Johnny has done something that we really appreciate, which is he has also talked about pine martins from an Irish perspective, because as I said, there are differences, and these are really important differences, and he is woven in that and the Irish context of whether it's folklore or conflict or habitat into the book. So it's Pine Martins by Johnny Burks, and it's lovely. It's a delight. It's a delight to read, but so informative as well.
Oh, fantastic! I will get that, order that for the shop. And it was Johnny Burke and Johnny Martin, was it? Or Martin?
Johnny Burks and John Martin.
John Martin. He's very appropriately named. John
yes,
Martin.
He is. And they are the most wonderful people to work with, and I've been lucky enough to work with them on and off over the years. And standing in this beautiful forest in Galway, surrounded by these, there was an incredible amount of trees that had been knocked over by the recent storms, and looking at den boxes, and we were checking den boxes using thermal imaging cameras to reduce any disturbance. And they have had great success in seeing pine martins breed in the den boxes, and you just learn so much from being around them. But they're just a tonic. They're absolutely wonderful.
That sounds like a very special moment as well. So thank you so much, Ruth, for coming on. I think we know a lot more about the pine marten now, and it's great that you can give a voice to an animal that sometimes needs a little bit of backup from humans. We really appreciate it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really loved it. Thank you, Mary.
And thank you for taking the time out of your day, and because I know you're so busy and you're up at night doing the horseshoe bat monitoring and everything is happening at the moment. It's just that time of year. So thank you so much for doing the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Nature Magic. News from the Burren Nature Sanctuary is that the turlock is in full bloom at the moment, with purple loosestrife, meadow sweet, forget-me-not and mint. RTE were filming the turlock or disappearing lake during the week. for a documentary on the Burren that we will have to wait 2 years to watch. Brian from Crossing the Line Productions waited patiently for sunrise and sunset and for the tides to fill this magical freshwater lake and then completely drain it again. The first of the Slow Cabins visitors stayed this week and had a wonderful time, and there is a 2-page spread on the launch of Slow Cabins in Ireland in the Daily Mail this week. To add to our conservation team for managing the wildflower meadow, and because they are just so fluffy, we have welcomed 2 ballet black-nosed sheep who are proving a huge hit with visitors and are ridiculously friendly. We are open every day in August, so pop in and say hello.